Howdy. Going to talk about risk and supply chain management. And as you talk about this, step back and look at supply chain and look at critical infrastructure and look at industrial control systems and look at our cost benefit analysis. And I'm hoping that you're beginning to see a pattern and a signature here. So a supply chain is just that. Think about what you had for lunch today. I had Cane's, fried chicken, French fries, I know, unhealthy, a soda. Now, let me think, where did those potatoes come from? Idaho? How did they get to wherever Cane's buys them processing? Train? Where did that chicken come from? Where were they raised? Where did my Dr. Pepper come from? Or let's think about something I have on my desk, my computer, for instance. All these parts, all these vendors, get sold to Microsoft, who puts together the Surface Pro, which is what I'm using. All these parts, they come from China, they come from the United States, they come from all over the world. They might have production in China, or India, or in Mexico, or I don't know where. They send some subcomponents, where they've taken components and put them into bigger components, but they're still not the whole machine, and they send them here and there. I go and I buy it at Best Buy or Fry's or Circuit City, or I guess that one's gone. How do they get there? Some of this stuff comes on ships, some comes on trucks. Nothing is done all in one place. I can't think of a single manufactured or produced product that we consume. Our food, we're not growing it in the backyard 100% and eating it at our kitchen table. Some may come up through the Port of Houston. Some may come up from local growers. That's the supply chain. Think about a complex system, a Joint Strike Fighter, your television, a building, all the components, and you break them down to where the components are being built and being transported and being assembled into something bigger. So it's complex, it's globally distributed, it's interconnected. Okay, and of course, a lot of this depends on critical infrastructure, autonomous vehicles, rail, land, sea, air. I learned that water is taking it in ships is typically cheaper than taking it by rail, truck, which is typically cheaper than rail. So it's all interconnected, and if you break a piece of that supply chain, something bad's going to happen. You're not going to get food on your table, or you're not going to get a needed part to build that computer or that rocket or that car or something. And it's really complicated because we're talking about now that the modern supply chain is technology, it's law, it's policy, it's procedures, it's practice. The law on land, sea, and air is all different. And so you think of the supply chain, again, highly automated, passing things off. Port of Houston does 400 million a day. You go down, look at that. You see the big containers being taken off the ships and being dispersed by truck or rail. But basically the supply chain is that whole effort: designing, manufacturing, producing, distributing, deploying, and using. So here's the risk. First of all, you have the good old risk of just somebody hacking into it, disrupt operations. Okay. Then you have counterfeit products, unauthorized production, tampering, theft, insertion of malicious software and hardware, poor manufacturing and development processes. So let me give you an example. I hack into the manufacturing system and I change the design specs for a critical part. Critical to a weapon system, critical to automotive, all right? Or I hack into a system and I steal your IP. And suddenly you have a competitor offshore that, good luck suing in that court. Or I tamper with something, or I flood it with unauthorized production from what I stole. All of these risks can be tied to hacking, right? Why would somebody do it? Well, it's cheap. I heard a talk by a Navy person a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about the Intel chips. 15% of what the DoD buys turns out to be counterfeit. They go to China where they have these big dump sites for electronics. They take stuff off, they repackage it, they sell it, through this complicated web of something. This particular speaker told the story about when they came up with a part number and a chip specification for something that did not exist, put it out for procurement, and within a couple days they had 24 or 24 or so vendors offering to supply a part that turns out never exist. And in fact, he said there was obviously collusion, because one of them even came back and lowered the price to be lower than someone else who came trying to sell something that didn't exist. So it's a real problem, and the best mechanism is to hack into the system, right? So here's the definition. I won't go through it on supply chain. You can look at NIST. They have documents on securing the supply chain and like. But it's just basically everything that's there, from designing, developing, manufacturing, processing, all of this. It's a wonderfully complex problem, but like any of this complexity, there's a lot of risk. So the risk is actually that first you could sabotage, you can introduce unwanted functions, you can change the design specs, you can do something that violates the integrity of the product, the manufacturing, or everything. And the goal is, so I want to deny, disrupt, degrade the function. I just want to do something. I just want to do something nefarious and bad to disrupt that supply chain. So we talked about this. Sorry for the interruption. I had an old slide in there somehow. Other examples are on the supply chain is anything such as this: pirates, counterfeit goods sold through the industry. Stuxnet. You could look at Stuxnet and say, didn't that disrupt a supply chain? Shamoon, brought down the largest corporation in the entire world. All right. So here's what I want you to think about. I want you to come sit back and look at the supply chain, critical infrastructure, these last couple of lectures on what I call the emerging topics. Go back to our basics. Risk is the possibility of suffering a loss, okay? Think about that in terms of your supply chain. An assessment, this is why we do risk assessment, so we can examine and measure. Look at the threats. For instance, I take over the control system of a ship coming into the Port of Houston, okay? I'm doing that, it's critical infrastructure. But when I also do that and I cause that ship to ram into the port, causing problems and bottlenecking it, I have now disrupted the supply chain. So I want you to think of these as all encompassing. You cannot talk about one without the other. And like any kind of risk, you can accept it, you can avoid it, you can mitigate it, you can transfer it. But here's the problems. How do we figure out the risk? How do we figure out the risk? That's beyond this class in supply chain. That would be another semester class. Here's another issue. Can you insure? Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Maritime, which is most of the waterways, something like, some huge percentage, 80-90% of everything you get somehow came across the water in some way, is international law. And they don't insure in maritime like they do traditional insurance. They instead pool money, because it came from the fact that at one time, let's say you had 5 large ship companies. So each of them would put $1 million in every year. And if something happened, one of the ships went down, they paid off that claim. They were self-insured. They're called pools. Well, that was before cyber attacks. Now what happens if a cyber attack brings down all 5 ships? So again, insurance in this area is different. Maritime, on land, in the air, different. Then you have the fact that because we do so much in maritime, you have the international law jurisdiction. So this has to do with this as well. I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you for listening.